From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden announces executive action to grant legal status and a pathway to citizenship to illegal aliens who crossed the border and then married U.S. citizens, about 500,000 people in all. Is this good policy? Is it legal? And is it an overstepping of the president's role in the U.S. system? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleague, columnist Kim Strassel. On Tuesday, the president was at an event celebrating the 12-year anniversary of President Obama's policy of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. That's the policy that shields dreamers, so-called, who were brought to this country over the border through no fault of their own when they were kids, and many have no memory of that journey or even another country. And now President Biden is announcing policy of his own that bears a resemblance to DACA. This is a program to grant a pathway to citizenship to about 500,000 spouses of U.S. citizens. Here is President Biden on Tuesday announcing the initiative.
For those wives or husbands and their children who have lived in America for a decade or more but are undocumented, this action will allow them to file paperwork for legal status in the United States, allow them to work while they remain with their families in the United States. Let's be clear, this action still requires undocumented spouses to file all required legal paperwork to remain in the United States. It requires them to pass a criminal background check, and it doesn't apply to anyone trying to come here today. So this action is a better way. It doesn't tear families apart while requiring every undocumented spouse to fulfill their obligations under the law. Look, the action I'm announcing today will go into effect later this summer. And by the way, just as was true for the protection of dreamers, the steps I'm taking today are overwhelmingly supported by the American people, no matter what the other team says.
Kim, what do you make of this, and what is the status quo for these people who cross the border illegally but are now married to U.S. citizens?
So let's talk about the policy first and what's changing. So as many people would know, usually marriage to a U.S. citizen provides a green card and a pathway to citizenship if you so choose. But the rules are very different for those who enter illegally. If you enter illegally and you want to go through this process, you have to return to your home country to apply for residency. And at that point, you may be barred from returning to the United States for up to 10 years. And understandably, very few families are willing to risk that kind of prolonged separation. So we do have this huge, significant number of spouses who are people who got over the border, are here illegally. They ended up marrying a U.S. citizen, and they're essentially living in the shadows because the only way to get right with the law would be to leave the United States for some unknown period of time. So what this is essentially going to do is the president, under the Department of Homeland Security, will issue a parole, in essence, that gives them the ability temporarily to stay here and to apply for that permanent residency. They have to have been here for 10 years. For this to count for them, they have to, as the president said, pass a background check and show that they have no threat. And then they'll have 3 years, they'll get a work permit, and they'll have 3 years to apply for citizenship. And this is going to apply to not just about 500,000 spouses of U.S. citizens, but about 50,000 of those spouses' children as well, by the White House's estimates. Why is this happening? Look, Democrats will say this is a humane thing to do, but you have to look at the timing here. I think it notable that you mentioned DACA. Of course, Barack Obama threw out DACA in 2012 as he was getting ready to run for election. It was a base stoker. It was meant to get him some political credit. It seems pretty clear President Biden is doing the same thing here. Just 2 weeks ago, he issued some new border measures that very much angered his progressive base. This looks like an attempt to sweeten that pill, especially because a lot of those progressives have been complaining that many of the more recent migrants who've been flowing over the border have been given more protections and considerations like work permits than many illegal migrants who have been living here over the years. So they consider that unfair. We can go through, I think, the terrible policy and legal implications of this, but that's why it's happening.
I can understand the reasonableness of this as a matter of policy. Just to add some more context to these numbers, there's some news reporting that says there are about 1.1 million undocumented immigrants married to U.S. citizens in the United States right now. And so more than half of them do not qualify for this, at least under the terms that Biden is putting forth right now and under the estimates that are being provided by the Department of Homeland Security. Again, some of them may have criminal records, so they don't qualify for this. Some of them may not have been in the United States for 10 years. But the 500,000 that we are talking about here, if they've been here for 10 years and they're married to a U.S. citizen, it's hard to see what is to be gained by sending them away and breaking up families in order for them to get legal status. It's also hard to see what is to be gained by not allowing them to work. If they're in these communities, they have kids that their families are trying to support. And as far as the magnet goes, I think part of what is important to think about in terms of immigration policy is what the incentives will be, what will draw more migrants. And if you are someone who is currently thinking about making a trek to the U.S. southern border, I'm not sure how much incentive this gives you, knowing that someone who made it here and has been here for 10 years and has found a U.S. citizen and married that U.S. citizen, I'm not sure how much added incentive to migrate that gives you. So I'm not sure that there is a huge downside here in terms of bringing more people or encouraging more people to come. But Kim, what about the legal side of this? My understanding is there is some precedent for this kind of parole in place, which is the legal term that is being used here. Apparently in 2007, under President George W. Bush, there began a program of parole in place for illegal immigrants who are parents or spouses of people serving in the U.S. military. So there is a fact sheet you can go find from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services that explains this. You may be eligible for parole in place in 1-year increments if you are the spouse, widow, widower, parent, son, or daughter of an active duty member of the U.S. Armed Forces. And then there are a couple of other categories, selected reserve, military veteran who served in active duty. And the point there, Kim, is that there is a real interest for the U.S. if you have a service member who is the child of an illegal immigrant, but who is serving overseas, of not breaking up that family, not deporting that person's parent while that person may be in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever, serving the interests of the United States.
Yeah, first of all, just on the policy, I think I would push back just a little bit on the question of the incentivization of this. I agree with you that the category of people that we are looking at here are the errors of past immigration policy, and for whatever reason they managed to get over the border in prior administrations. They would have had to quite some time ago if they've been here 10 years. And, they're now part of communities, et cetera. But this is always the peril of having a broken immigration policy that allows that, because when you go to remedy it, you do essentially make a little bit of a mockery of the law. I mean, this provision about needing to apply for residency from outside the country is meant to be a deterrent for illegal immigration. And one thing I worry is that people don't need much of an excuse right now to be coming to the United States to cross the border. And just a mere thought that this kind of a dispensation for spouses could be granted again a couple years from now, or for people who have been here not as long. I think anything like that is essentially a prod sometimes for more people to try to make the trek to the United States. But on the legality of this is a program, as you know, called Parole in Place, and it stems out of our immigration law. And that immigration law originally allowed the Attorney General to provide parole on and I'm going to quote here, only on a case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit, end quote. Now, the authority to do that was transferred by Congress back in 2003 to the Department of Homeland Security. So it's now DHS's role to do this. You already have Republicans insisting that this violates the Immigration and Naturalization Act, that is a statute in question, because of the case-by-case provision in it, and because of the humanitarian or public benefit argument attached to it. Those cases that you mentioned in which parole has been granted to the spouses or children of those married to active U.S. service members or reserve members have been very specific, and it's been used fairly sparingly and very much on a case-by-case basis, and arguably on the public benefit argument given the service of those active duty military members. We've obviously had a case, in fact, went up to the Supreme Court where the Biden administration has a parole program for residents coming from very specific countries, in particular those that are seen to have humanitarian crises. And that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said it was within the administration's right to do that on a humanitarian basis. The argument and the question that's going to come up in any litigation here is, I think, a couple of things. Can you argue that a blanket group of people that you have described this largely as essentially being someone who's married to an American, having been here 10 years and having no criminal record, if you're providing anything on a case-by-case basis in that element? The administration was at pains in all of its press releases to say everyone will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, but they are coming in a very large lump here. And also whether or not you can argue that, for instance, someone who's already been living here, presumably peacefully for 10 years, can claim that they are in a humanitarian crisis, or how you would argue for the public benefit side. I'm not saying that's impossible, but I do think that that's why the law has never been used this way before.